Hey everybody, it's the king of all wrestling media, Gene Jackson here for episode number 2 of Old School Dives, and we will be joined in just a few moments by my co-host Shane Noles. He's having a little bit of technical difficulties here, but he's trying to get in here so we can get started on tonight's episode talking about the one and only Tommy Wildfire Rich. So should be a fun show. I appreciate all the great feedback we got on the Jesse the Body Ventura episode. We had a lot of fun doing that, and glad people enjoyed it. I'm glad people are liking, the show so far, and it will probably continue to evolve and get better as we go along. But just to, kind of lay this out here while we got a minute, while we're waiting for Shane Knowles to get in. We're not always going to follow like a hard timeline on these episodes. We're going to try to cover as much of these guys' career as we can, especially the highlights. But the show mostly is, us giving insight on the aspects of these guys' careers that, we're both familiar with or that, we were a fan of. And so, we're not going to be able to cover everything, especially on a guy like Tommy Rich. I mean, you look at how far his career has spanned. I mean, he started in 1974 and he's still having matches to this day. But we will try to follow a timeline for the most part, but we will jump around here and there, as you saw with the Jesse Ventura episode, as we, sometimes one subject that comes up makes us move forward. And sometimes we have to jump back to kind of cover something we may have missed or got ahead of ourselves. So hopefully people don't hold our feet to the fire too hard as far as being, strict to the timeline as we go through and talk about these guys. We're just going to try to, like I say, hit, the high points of their careers, and especially the things that we both have knowledge of, we both remember, we watched, or, stood out to us. And those are the things that we'll try to cover, more in depth. But like I say, hopefully Shane will be able to join us here in just a moment while we're waiting on him to get here. Let's take a look real quick. If you haven't yet, check out our friend Charles Zanders' podcast, the ZIP, Zanders Inspirational Podcast. We're going to take a real quick look at a promo for that, and then we'll be right back. Hopefully Shane will be here and we can get started talking about Tommy Wildfire Rich. Get ready to get inspired. It's Xander's Inspirational Podcast, the brand new podcast with upbeat Xanders, as he has one-on-one podcast sessions that both inspire and inform. Check it out as Xanders has a one-on-one interview with some of your favorite people in and out of the professional wrestling business. Give it a listen on cheaptvlive.com. There you see it. Xander's Inspirational Podcast got a new episode of that coming up that he recorded today. And the one that he recorded today should be a fun one. Of course, that first episode, if you hadn't checked it out, the one he did with Wicked Nemesis was a great interview. Wicked, talked about a lot of fun and interesting topics, but also some pretty deep personal topics. And so if you haven't checked that one out, make sure you do. And when the new episode drops, you definitely want to check it out because it's an interview with a guy who has a lot of wrestling knowledge and has had a big hand in a lot of guys' careers. And so he has a lot to offer, and I think that'll be an interesting interview to check out. So, wait a minute. It looks like he's here. Let's take a look. There he is. Shane Knowles.
I think I'm finally here, Gene. Sorry for my delayed arrival.
Not a problem, buddy. Not a problem. We were just showing everybody a quick promo for our buddy Charles Zanders' podcast. And so we took a look at that and talked about his first episode with Wicked Nemesis that I hope everybody goes and checks out. But how are you doing tonight?
Well, I am well now that I hope my technical difficulties are solved. That may not be done just yet.
Appears you're in a very dark room all of a sudden.
Let's.
But we can hear you good. So, I mean, as long as we can hear you, we can move forward for the time being, and then hopefully the picture will come back. Hey, there you are.
How about now?
All right, that's good.
Beautiful.
So there for a couple of minutes while I was stalling, talking to everyone, I was kind of covering the fact that, we got some good feedback on the Jesse the Body Ventura episode. glad people liked it, and that this is still kind of a work in progress. We're still kind of feeling our way through how we're going to do this podcast. But one thing I kind of reminded everybody is we're not going to follow, like, this isn't kayfabe commentaries where we're going to follow a hard timeline where we're going to hit every facet of someone's career, because, like I said, Tommy Rich has been in the business since 1974 and is still participating in matches as recently as March, I see. So there's no way to in-depthly cover everything. So what we're really looking to do is, hit the high spots of the things that, we kind of have a knowledge of, the things we remember and enjoyed, and kind of have something to offer on. And hey, sometimes the topic may bring us forward and we may have to go back to cover something else. But if everybody just kind of go with the flow, have fun with it, I think we'll be fine. Like I said, I just hope people aren't upset that we're going to be jumping around a bit. That's just going to be the nature of the show. And I think it'll be better that way. I think it'll be a little more fun that way, because we don't feel so hard pressed to cover every little thing in order, which sometimes can get tedious, in my opinion. I think we've lost Shane Noles again. This is going to be a tough one, folks. There he is. He's back.
There I am. Oh, goodness.
Right.
I'm sorry. Wi-Fi is not my friend this evening.
It happens sometimes, man. It happens to the best of us. So let's try to get into it here. So, like I said, Tommy Rich broke into wrestling in 1974. He was trained by Jerry Jarrett, Tojo Yamamoto, and I think he credits Jerry Lawler for having a hand in his training, and Dick Steinborn and a couple other people. What's the earliest memory you have of seeing Tommy Rich?
Well, Gene, that would actually be in person. The first wrestling event I ever attended in my life, 1985, at the VFW Fairgrounds in Carrollton, Georgia, which later became the home for Peach State Wrestling Alliance for a number of years, my own company. So that's why, sometimes I tell people it's kind of surreal to be running events in this venue.
Wow.
Where so many promoters, so many stars came back in through the day. But yeah, the first time I ever saw Tommy, or my memory, early 1985 in the spring, I think it was April, on that card. And this would have been a Georgia Championship Wrestling stop right there. The Fantastics, Bobby Fulton, Tommy Rogers were in action. I still have an autographed 8x10 from them from that particular show. But in the main event that night was Tommy Rich and Johnny Rich versus the Assassins. And this little 6-year-old boy will never forget the reaction for Tommy Rich in the main. And don't get me wrong, they like Johnny Rich too, but I think it was kind of association here. But Tommy was the guy. And I just remember everything, the bleach blonde hair, the charisma, the pointing towards the Assassins. And I mean, I'll do some impressions later, I'm sure, but with the, we gonna get it on tonight, baby doll, right here in Carrollton. And that place just erupted. And then started seeing Tommy on TV. We'll get into all that. But that's my first memory, would have been in the spring of 85, personally.
I don't think, like, people who are only aware of Tommy, even like the 89, 90 range of WCW, then especially on into the Thomas Rich era and further, and even especially people who only saw him in ECW, I don't think they can really understand or appreciate the level of babyface that Tommy Rich was in the early 80s, especially in Georgia, but also in Alabama, Tennessee, all throughout the Southeast. He was beloved, and people who are really in the know from that era, because of the Superstation on TBS, Tommy Rich is really considered one of the first nationwide TV wrestling superstars. Even before Hulkamania or any of that caught on, Tommy Rich was one of the first just full-on beloved baby faces, especially in the Southeast.
And yeah, I want to expound on that for our younger listeners who may not know.
I don't know. I don't know if Shane was only frozen for me or if he was frozen for everybody there.
I was saying when Ted Turner started broadcasting TBS, the Superstation nationwide, as you alluded to, Tommy Rich was the guy. And there were people, when I would book Tommy Rich later on, and we'll get into that at Peach State, there were people who came that told me in that late 70s, early 80s, that's what got them hooked on professional wrestling was TBS broadcasting wrestling nationwide, and Tommy Rich was the dude, and because of that, recognized in 1981 by Pro Wrestling Illustrated as most popular wrestler of the year. So yeah, that predates Hulkamania, as you were talking about, for a short window there. Tommy Rich was the babyface in professional wrestling. You can see, yeah, the PWI cover there.
He graced the cover of PWI quite a few times in his career. That not necessarily been the one you were referencing, but it was the first one I could find as I was scrolling through. Here's a look at very young Tommy Rich with Tojo Yamamoto. Like we mentioned, that was one of the guys who trained him, but he also teamed with Tojo quite a bit in Tennessee throughout the Memphis territory, as it were. I've seen some like some really older stuff from like him and Lawler in Memphis from like the late 70s and early 80s, and he was a lot smaller guy then. Like when he first started out, he was a lot smaller guy than what we became used to, and on into the 80s there we were kind of talking about around 85 and that time frame. But I guess we'll kind of jump to it here. I mean, like I say, we're going to kind of be all over the place, and we may backtrack a little bit, but one of the things that always stood out to me once I became aware of him, which was kind of around that same time frame. Like I remember seeing Tommy Rich in 85, 86. But as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, what really stands out of my mind as a kid, or stood out in my mind and really locked him into my head was 87 in Memphis, teaming with Austin Idol when they posted Jerry Lawler and they shaved his head or gave him the haircut, whatever you want to call it. But they always mentioned former NWA World Champion Tommy Rich. And of course, in my lifetime at that point, I really was only familiar with Flair, Harley Race. To me, were the NWA World Champions. So to think that Tommy Rich had been a former NWA World Champion. Of course, as I get a little older and do a little more research, you find out that it was a 4-day title reign. He won it in Augusta, Georgia, and let me see if I can find the date on that right quick. Augusta, Georgia, April 27th, 1981, he defeated Harley Race and became the NWA World Champion. 4 days later in Gainesville, he lost the title back. There's been a lot of speculation and rumor and different things over the years about that title reign and how it came about and why it came about. But I mean, you can't take it, especially in the kayfabe era. No matter if it lasted 4 days or 4 hours, the man defeated Harley Race to be the NWA World Champion. And I mean, that was huge on his resume. And to this day, he still brags about it. And why wouldn't you?
And that was the belt, Gene, as you spoke of. The same thing, Ric Flair, Harley Race, and then Terry Funk being the former champion, the Briscoes. And that's not a very long list when you look at just those 5 or 6 guys, how long they held the NWA title until we're going back into Rogers, Luthez, whatnot. But Tommy Rich is forever etched in history. When that belt, and I don't want to be a detriment to anything that's going on now with those 3 initials, but when the NWA World title really, 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 truly meant the world in professional wrestling, someone thought enough of him, and as you said, speculation, rumor, and innuendo of how and why he may have got the belt. But, as we look at it, 4 decades later, it doesn't matter, or almost 4 decades later, how you got the belt, the fact that you are that champion, that's something to hang your hat on. But speaking of titles, and I know we're jumping all over here, the first Charlotte Fan Fest that I ever attended in 2010, and I know we've got some Tommy stories, but this really isn't one about Tommy. That first year, Rick Martel was there, and anybody who knows me knows Rick Martel's in my personal top 5, so it was such an honor to get to meet him. And while talking with him, he asked me, was I in the business? I said, promoted in Georgia. Rick Martel's first words were, wow, he's like, had some good times in Georgia when I was NWA Georgia Tag Team Champions with Tommy Rich. And I thought he was kidding. I went, huh? And he was like, yeah, I mean, and so like, after shaking his hand, I immediately I had a flip phone, so I had to wait to my laptop till I got in this was 2010, in the room and found out, mind blown, that Tommy Rich and Rick Martel were NWA Georgia Tag Team Champions together. But then also Tommy, people that he was a 7-time NWA Georgia Tag Team Champion with partners such as Rick Martel, Stan Hansen, Tony Atlas, Wahoo McDaniel, The Crusher, and Thunderbolt Patterson. Now that's a pretty impressive resume to be holding tag straps with.
That's a who's who of that era right there. I mean, just the thought of a Tommy Rich, Rick Martel tag team in that era.
I know.
Ladies, the ladies were crazy for both those guys. So you put them together, I can only imagine the high-pitched screams and windows shattering.
And you're right. It had to be the good-looking white meat baby faces that the ladies love because, a French Canadian and a guy from Tennessee, I don't know how much they would mesh, personality-wise.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine the stories that Martel can, tell just of hanging at the culture shock for him to come down there and go run the roads with Tommy Rich for a few months in Georgia. Something else that when people talk about Tommy Rich, inevitably, if it's anybody with any, long-term fandom, it's going to come up that he's former NWA World Champion. The other thing that's inevitably going to come up is possibly his most famous feud. And if you're like me, if you're a tape trader, it was the holy grail of tape trading that finally found its way to the WWE Network a few years ago. And, of course, that was his epic feud with Buzz Sawyer, of course, that culminated in that last Battle of Atlanta. The first, as far as I know, the first ever steel cage match with a roof on top, similar to what we later became known as War Games, except it was just one ring. But there was pictures and magazines of it when I was a kid. And like I said, there was, stories over the years that there was tapes out there somewhere and people would offer them up for trade. And then you would get some 10th generation, some random cage match they did somewhere that wasn't the last Battle of Atlanta. And then it finally, it came up like, hey, they've got it on WWE Network. And there it was all these years later. But it's crazy how highly regarded that feud is and still talked about to this day. And it was a brutal, bloody affair every time they got in the ring, it seemed. Of course, that's something else, Tommy, and that's what I was going to say too. Besides NWA World Champion, besides the feud with Bud Sawyer, Tommy Rich was known and is known for bleeding a lot.
As Jeff G. Bailey would say, he got that good effing color every time. It was... And, you mentioned the Buzz Sawyer thing. Jim Cornette had spoke, because he kind of gets credit for inventing Hell in a Cell. He said, all I did was a modification on the last Battle of Atlanta that Tommy Rich did with Buzz Sawyer. He's like, that concept really predates anything that I was thinking. But, man, could you imagine being in the Omni that night? Because I know Buzz Sawyer, there's a lot of detriment towards him about what kind of human being he was and what he did to people he trained. But as a heel, believability on Buzz Sawyer, man, when he stepped through those ropes, even as a kid, even now, I was like, that guy's not someone to tussle with.
No, you go back and watch those tapes and the intensity, his Mid-South stuff and then in Georgia and Mid-Atlantic and everywhere you saw him, he had an intensity about him that it made you believe like that guy right there is crazy. That dude, he's hurting people. Like they're not having fun in there right now.
Go ahead, Gene. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I didn't know if you had anything else to add to Buzz Sawyer or that feud or anything.
Yeah, that feud. I mean, the fact that what are we looking at? 41 years later, and people still talk about that match. And like you said, that became one of those kind of like Bret Hart versus Tom McGee. I want to see it. I've heard about it. Where's it at? Kind of deals. You would only see pictures. And I think in black and white, I don't know if I've ever seen a colored picture of the last Battle of Atlanta, but to me, that black and white pictures in the magazines or those still shots, to me, that just added to the allure of that match. And but Tommy also a 3-time NWA Georgia heavyweight champion. Certainly when that was one of the top, and I'm not mistaken, I think he beat Ole Anderson for that belt. But there's another rivalry of Ole, and maybe even some into Gene and Lars, but Ole and Tommy Rich, my goodness. But I feel like in that time frame, and we're just jumping here, Tommy had a good feud with Ric Flair on Georgia Championship Wrestling back in the day. But if I had to start naming some of these opponents, the Buzz Sawyers, the Ole Andersons, the Assassins, and Abdullah the Butcher, which going into 2009, 2010 on independent shows, one of them at State Farm Arena, you would have thought it was 1984 all over again. Tommy Rich bled, Abdullah bled, the referee bled, security bled, and people in attendance, they really didn't know what to think about some of that because the rest of the show features a lot of high spots and a lot of back and forth and whoop-de-doos, and here's these two guys making you believe that this is an absolute street fight brawl with color all over the place. I remember seeing some of the faces of younger people, like they weren't used to that kind of pro wrestling, but that used to be on a given night, any given night in the South, especially.
Yeah, it's a whole nother era. It's a completely different presentation of pro wrestling than what even was going, like you say, even that time frame, and especially now. Man, I mean, and this is definitely jumping around, but talking about Tommy Rich and being known for his bleeding. I'm trying to find the picture if it sounds like I'm kind of rambling, but here it is. A famous Memphis angle. He came back to Memphis after one of his stints in Georgia, and Steve Kern and Stan Lane had just left Memphis to go to the AWA, and Jerry Jarrett was pretty salty about it. So they put Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert together as Fargo's Fabulous Ones. They were the new Fabulous Ones, and it went over like a fart in church for the most part in Memphis. People just did not get on board with new Fabulous Ones, especially with two guys as established as Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert were in Memphis. And so eventually the team split up and they kind of went their separate ways. And then they did an angle on Memphis TV one Saturday morning. They had a wrestling fan convention in town, and a bunch of the fans that were in this club or whatever you call that at the time were all in the studio audience, and they had given the Tag Team of the Year award to Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert. And so they brought them out and they gave him the award, and Eddie ends up attacking Tommy, ramming his head in the ring post, bloody. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Tommy rams Eddie's head in the ring post, busts him open because Eddie had trashed him, said he was a terrible tag team partner, and he didn't need him. He was a loser. So Tommy snaps, rams Eddie's head in the ring post, just bloodies him up, beats the hell out of him. They go to commercial break. And when they come back, Eddie's out there, with a bandage on his forehead, and he calls Tommy out. He's like, look, I'm sorry. You were right. You were a great tag team partner. I see the error of my ways now. I just want to apologize. Congratulations. We won this award together. And at the end of it, Eddie rams Tommy's head in the ring post, busts him open. He bleeds because he just happens to be wearing white, of course, as tends to happen sometimes in wrestling. Busts Eddie open. He bleeds all over the place. And it was a pretty famous angle in Memphis. And what was fun about it to me, I didn't see it back then when it happened. I saw it when he reused it as Booker of Continental when the Nightmares split up. They reenacted that whole thing. Ken Wayne pissed Danny Davis off, and they did the whole scenario back. And then when I was reading about the Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert thing later, when I started tape trading, I'm like, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. That was the Nightmare thing. And then I found out Eddie Gilbert was booking it, so on and so forth. But that was a pretty big angle they ran there for a little while with Rich against Eddie Gilbert, and both those guys, like I say, known for bleeding and that pre-hardcore style of wrestling, what became pretty famous in Memphis. And, Eddie ends up going off and helping create ECW, and that's bringing that Memphis Tupelo concession stand brawls style wrestling to the Northeast and all that. And then, like I say, Tommy Rich continued to do it across the South, I guess to this day to some degree, because I see pictures every now and again just in the last few years, like you say, of him bloodied up and still making it happen.
Over 2 decades on the independent circuit, because I think he left ECW maybe late 99, early 2000, right in there. So, yeah. Now, the last time I spoke with Tommy, and I don't know if this is still valid, he and Tony Atlas were opening a wrestling school in South Carolina together. Atlas being one of his, longtime associates, former tag team champion in Georgia with him. But that would have been, last year at the Charlotte convention. He said he and Tony were looking to open a school in South Carolina. I don't know if that ever came to fruition.
I don't know if it did or not, because I remember reading some things about it and seeing Tommy promoting it, and I don't really know if it got off. I don't know if COVID might have slowed that down or stopped it altogether or what. But I do remember hearing about that and thinking that was an interesting pairing of Tommy Rich and Tony Atlas to be training people. But I mean, they both have quite the careers behind them. You mentioned earlier, first time you saw Tommy Rich, he was teaming with Johnny Rich. So I thought we'd take a moment here. There you see all three of the Rich cousins. You see Tommy, and then on the left, you see Johnny Rich, and on the right, you see Davey Rich. Of course, Johnny Rich started out in Memphis as Roy Rogers. Davey Rich started out in Memphis as David Haskins, which is his legit name. And both of them were kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say enhancement. Haskins more or less was an enhancement guy. Johnny Rich as Roy Rogers got used fairly well. But then when they went over to Alabama and became Tommy's cousins, they did pretty well over there. Of course, Haskins, did some enhancement stuff for Watts and UWF. Later, both of them ended up in like around 89 doing jobs in WCW. And I think Haskins even did I seen him on like some old Superstars Wrestling from like 86 on there doing some matches. But man, you talking about getting the rub from somebody. I mean, the best thing they ever did was become Tommy Rich's cousins, because it gave them a career in the South throughout the 80s and into the 90s. And they still do conventions appearances and things like that, and team up with Tommy here and there every now and again.
You spoke earlier when WCW around that like late or early '89 when he came in as like babyface. I remember he was wearing like the peach colored, maybe like the tie-dyed peach.
Tie-dyed, yes.
And he put on maybe 30, 40 pounds since I had last seen him in Continental maybe 2 years earlier. And I remember thinking like Tommy Rich is in these TV matches, and every now and then an announcer would refer to him as a former NWA World Champion, kind of like almost in passing, not like really putting over an accolade. But Tommy would be losing to guys that, even as 11 or 12 years old, I'm like, he shouldn't be losing. I mean, this is a former NWA champion. I've seen this guy be, and of course, now you understand how the business works. But then I'm just like, what is Tommy Rich doing losing on a Saturday night in the third match in 7 minutes, with maybe 90 seconds of offense and then selling the rest of the way and getting beat? But I haven't told a whole lot of people this, but that York Foundation that was later formed, one of my favorite underrated factions, managed by Alexandra York. Now we know her as Terry Runnels. But the thing that I loved about this, and of course the beef for that, wasn't it? Big Cat, Mr. Hughes was the beef of that. But what I love, and you've got that picture up there, those are three guys with three of the most impressive shags of long hair or mullets in the forms of Ricky Morton, Terry Taylor, and Tommy Rich. And we take the old Southern good old boy name and we give the given name that I'm sure is on their birth certificates into Richard Morton, Terrence Taylor, and Thomas Rich, and made them slick their hair backs and pull it in ponytails. And I remember just thinking, like, there were so many people where I lived that just did not like the fact. They're like, his name's not Thomas Rich, it's Tommy Rich. That ain't Richard Morton, that's Ricky Morton. That ain't Terrence Taylor, that's Terry Taylor. I don't know what they're doing. And it was just simple stuff, but using the computer with analytics to scout your opponents, and with Hughes being the beef on that. I don't know how long that group stayed together. I think it was through late 92 or early 92. It was only like a year maybe, but I thought they had some good potential there.
It only got pushed very briefly, and I think it had legs. And I think if they'd really invested more time in it, it could have been more than what it was. Because like you say, it was changing the name and slicking their hair back was about as far as they went. Like Ricky still wore like the bandanas around his legs, and Tommy still wore most of the same stuff. But they started losing pretty quickly. But I thought the whole gimmick around the time frame it was with her using the computer and the probability of them winning, and they're gonna win in this amount of time, and I really liked it when it first started. I mean, I think it had a lot
Don't
of
spend
potential.
any. Yeah, don't spend any extra time in the squared circle. When they would have to bail out, she would start typing in on the database for counters, and this is what we scouted on this and that. Because as the world moved into the '90s, like the new information age, I guess that was perfect at the forefront, and they won the six-man titles in WCW. I think before they disbanded. But
They
that was
did.
such a fun. That was such a. I remember that. It's so vivid in my mind as an 11 or 12-year-old on Saturday nights. The York Foundation, and that was our first, introduction into Terry Runnels in that role.
Yes, who would become Marlena and then eventually Terry Runnels.
Mm-hmm.
But something you touched on there, I want to back up to real quickly is just that time as a fan. Like I grew up on Southern wrestling, and you would see, like you say, Johnny and Davey Rich are the tag team champions in Continental, and Tommy Rich was Continental champion and Southeastern champion and tag champion and all these different things. And even guys like Alan Martin would get wins down there,
Yes.
and you're not, I mean, okay, this isn't on the up and up, but you don't have any understanding in 80, I did anyway, in 88, 89, 90, even how any of this works, or the whys or the hows or any of that. And so, I'm watching Johnny and Davey Rich, Continental Tag Team Champions. They're beating, they've had matches against Lord Humongous at different times. And now all of a sudden, they show up against the Skyscrapers on a WCW Saturday night and just get destroyed in like
Right.
a minute. And like you say, and then Tommy's out there, and I've seen him not only in Continental, but in Memphis, where have every title in the territory at some point, main events for years and years, and he's losing in 6 minutes to who take your pick of who all he lost to at the time. It was strange though, because he had this big run of, like you say, of not really getting any wins and losing to people that he shouldn't have been losing to. But then all of a sudden he had this really competitive series with Lex Luger for the U.S. title, and where there's even a couple times like, damn, he might win the U.S. title against Luger. So that was that was odd booking to me too. But that is the kind of things that, as a wrestling fan, really made me question, like, why are these guys so tough in Continental and Memphis, and then they just get destroyed when they go to WCW or WWF?
And it was in that same time frame, 89, 90. I remember thinking another guy, the Iron Sheik, who was the former WWF World Champion. He's also losing in like four, and it didn't look right. He's wearing orange neon trunks on the Iron Sheik, and he's losing in like 4 minutes on WCW Saturday Night. I'm like, this was the guy that, beat Bob Backlund. I mean, him and Tommy Rich in that time frame as an 11, 12-year-old, so confusing. Like,
Hulkamania kicked off by beating the Iron Sheik for the WWF title, and now he's in here getting, beat, like you say, in 2 or 3 minutes by name your job, or, Mike
Rap Master PNU.
Yes.
I will never forget that. Yo Baby Yo beat Iron Sheik in like 3 minutes. And I think that match he was wearing like pink or neon green trunks. And I'm like, did Sheiky lose his laundry somewhere? I mean, did he have to borrow Tom Zink's gear for this? But
and then it all made sense later in one of those Cornette shoots. I don't know. I think it's one of the timelines he did with Sean Oliver, which were great. But he said, they let Sheik's contract roll over, and they had to send him home because he couldn't even do jobs worth a damn.
Exactly.
He just paid him to sit home because it got to where he couldn't even do the jobs. I was like, damn. But anyway, that's kind of a sidetrack. But since you pointed out, I thought that's kind of an interesting thing to address.
And during that time frame, I think this match is on YouTube. There is of course, we're not probably surprised that Flair gave him this much, but there's a very competitive Ric Flair Tommy Rich match from WCW Saturday Night during that 89, maybe early 90 time frame as Flair's getting ready for Sting at Great American Bash. And forgive me if I fudge on the time a little bit, but it went about 12, 14 minutes, and Tommy Rich got a lot. And I went back and watched some of that recently, and I was like, you could just see that Flair had worked with this dude almost a decade earlier when he was the top babyface, and he was probably like, I'm not going to go out there and beat him in 2 minutes. If Tommy Rich can go with me.
And again, this is getting kind of sidetracked off Tommy Rich, but this is another topic that I've heard mentioned over the years that people kind of said was a knock on Flair. And at the end of this, I may kind of get your opinion on this whole Flair's last match, the way it's come together the last couple of days. But but I even thought about this as a kid because I remember asking my dad this was like, you take George South, Mike Jackson, guys of that ilk, and most of the time they'd go out there and just get destroyed by Jimmy Garvin, Ronnie Garvin, Shaska Lee, take your pick.
Mm-hmm.
But then Ric Flair, the world heavyweight champion, would go out there and have a competitive 4 to 5 minute match with George South, flip in the corner, run up the thing, get tossed, like all the Flair, high spots. And you'd be thinking, damn, like, how come all these other guys can just beat George South like a drum, and then Flair has problems with it? But I've had arguments with people in the past, psychology-wise, because I've had younger people throw that in my face, like, oh, Ric Flair, blah, blah. But I'm like, well, look at it this way. Ric Flair was the heel champion, and people bought tickets and paid money on the hope that the babyface was going to win the title. Mm-hmm. If I'm watching TV on a Saturday night and I'm trying to ponder whether I'm going to go pay money because they're 40 miles down the road and he's going to wrestle Lex Luger or Nikita Koloff, and George South just almost beat him in my mind, I might be more apt to go pay that money. He's like, well, hell, if he almost lost to George South, I'm going to see a title change down here in Columbus tonight when he wrestles, Koloff. Do you think that's kind of the thinking there, or like what's your take on that? Do you think that made Flair look weak, or does it put more heat on him and make it more likely to think that any babyface at any time could take that title and you probably should be there?
I think he was the master of what the NWA champion was supposed to do, as we've learned later. They were supposed to travel the country, go to all the regional territories, get so close with either the top babyface, usually the top babyface, and make those fans believe, God, he just took the NWA champion to the limit. And if he comes back here again, I know he can take him. And it solidified that guy to their territory as the champion moved on to whether it be St. Louis or Portland or whatnot. So I thought Flair was brilliant in that regard, because the old adage, you're only as good as who you beat. And if you go out there and say, I beat a piss ant in a tomato can, well, if you make them look like that and you beat that, then what's the point? So, I mean, even with enhancement talent like Mike, like a Chick Donovan, like you mentioned George, he made George South's career for a lot of people. That disagreement with Ole where Flair was like, pin me. And George said, in that moment, I thought, no, if I pin him and become the champion, it's not going to be Flair that gets fired. It's going to be me. And he basically kicked out himself. But I think what you're alluding to, if I was older during that time frame, and maybe even during my time young watching it, if a guy on TV took him to the limit and it's just George South or it's just Mike Jackson, boy, he doesn't have a chance against Lex Luger, Nikita, or Magnum because he's right for the picking. So I don't think it's a detriment to that. I think, the old adage, Flair could work with a broomstick, just so giving to the bit. Because what you're talking about, these guys, George South, Chick Donovan, Mike Jackson, he didn't have to do that. If he wanted to go out there and beat them in 60 seconds, I'm going to lock up with you, arm drag, I'm going to call the whole match, shoot you off the ropes, give you an elbow. You try to get up, I'll clip your leg from behind, I'll work the leg for about 10 seconds, figure four, let's go home. He could have done that. But what would the crowd have done? They would have sat there, ho-hum, we have to hear Rick Braggett. But no, he gave those people those electric moments where they thought, oh, my God. And, Gene, what you're talking about, and I'm going long-winded on this, but some of the footage on that, if you look in the studio audience, not just clapping, not just – some of these people are rabid up and down going nuts at the mere thought that Flair could drop that title on any given moment, even to a guy like a George South.
And you got to think about those people that have sat in that studio and watched some of those marathon tapings. And most of those guys, like I say, you had Ronnie Garvin and the Road Warriors and Lex Luger, and people are going out there just eating folks up. And they've just watched all these one-sided. It was almost like just wrestling a crash dummy that can stand itself back up, because, it didn't resemble a match. And then all of a sudden, here's the world champion in the ring. And oh, my God, this guy's getting the better of him. Oh, my God, he might win. I figured that was probably the most exciting moment of the show, despite, even if it wasn't Ric Flair, just the fact that, something's happening besides us just watching a guy just get killed in here. Because, man, I like going back and watch some old shows. And you watch like Ronnie Garvin would just brutalize those guys, take them down, and just
Mm-hmm.
stretch them, and just I mean, just haul off and just I mean, it's just brutal to watch now, knowing what I know now, and going back and watching it. Like I didn't realize when I was a kid, like how bad roughed up those, and like the Road Warriors. Like me and Rosie was watching one, an animal picked Alan Martin over his head and just threw him out to the floor. And we had watched that on like a Friday night, and just so happened on Saturday night we went and did a show in Sylacauga, and Alan Martin was on the show, and so he walked up over to my wife. We had a gimmick table, and he walked over, looking around, and she's like, "You're Alan Martin, right?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah." Seemed excited somebody recognized him because this was just a few years ago, and she's like,
"Good dude, by the way. I like."
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we had a blast talking to him. But she was like, "We watched a match Friday night where on like the TBS show where he was wrestling Road Warriors and Animal." And before she could finish the sentence, goes, "Threw my ass straight out to the floor." She's like,
yeah.
He's like, back then, he's like, it was the kiss of death. If you come in and saw your name on that board across from Hawk and Animal, he said it was just like later on when the Steiner brothers came along. He's like, you knew it was going to be a bad night. He said, and they were great guys. He said, but he said, as far as us, the enhancement guys, jobbers, whatever you want to call us, he's like, they had no regard for how we landed, where we went. He said they just threw you, and it was brutal. But it was cool. I mean, I'd been around him a couple of times, but it was cool to get to talk to somebody and just kind of hear their perspective on it and go, "Oh, it is exactly as it appeared. It wasn't misleading. It wasn't like some kind of trick. Like, no, they just beat the hell out of us. That's what it was."
Well, and one more little tidbit on Flair, I guess, before we move back to talking about Flair. Mike Jackson told me one time, this may have been 6-7 years ago, that Flair didn't often work the Saturday morning TV show. It would always be promos, because if we think about it, how many of these alligators down, or the girls in the limo, and when I come to insert city here, Philadelphia, Baltimore, blah, 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 blah. We didn't really see Flair wrestle a whole lot, but when he would, it would always be against enhancement talent. And Mike told me, he said, you know how Flair picked who he wanted to wrestle? Whoever happened to be in a carload with Mike or with anybody else, these guys were all carpooling together, he would ask guys to come up off their bench or their chair and lock up. And based on the way you locked up, Flair thought, I can work with you. And I remember asking Mike, I said, what's that mean? Flair said, if you can lock up, that's half the battle, because I can work around you or give you things to do to me as long as that looks good. And I never thought of it that way. Like, if you can do a professional lockup, I can work 4 or 5 minutes with you.
Yeah, because if you're dead at the lockup, I mean, what can you do? That's pretty genius, actually. So we showed Jesse's first cards.
Oh my goodness gracious!
Everybody we do that has one of these, we're gonna show them. But yeah, there's the very first Tommy Wildfire Rich wrestling card. Now he went on to have some WCW ones later on.
I was about to say, I've got these. There's about 6 action shots of Tommy Rich. Yeah.
They are somewhere in this room in a drawer. I wish I'd have dug them out. I only had 3 weeks to do it, but I didn't do it. But that was fun. And this isn't really. There's one there of Tommy.
Wow.
Ric Flair on the cover of the Wrestler. Magnificent Battle of the Golden Boys right there. That's a fun one. And there, let me find another one of these magazine covers we got here. We got The Burning Desire is back. And there he is with Flair again. So he not only graced the cover of a lot of magazines, but he shared the cover with Flair on quite a few of these. And here's one of his infamous heel turns there.
As Gene is showing us these magazine covers for younger listeners, viewers, Pro Wrestling Illustrated was the top dog. But yes, Inside Wrestling, The Wrestler, these were magazines that were available nationwide at every supermarket, every newsstand. Yes, newsstands, kids, and those were the thing. Newsstands and groceries. I remember seeing Tommy Rich's face at Kroger, at Ingles, at A&P. There's an old grocery store chain for you.
That's right.
At drugstores, you would see Tommy, and a lot of times the hair was matted, and sometimes there was blood. And think about that. People were seeing this all across the country. And I wonder during that time how many people's introduction to pro wrestling was maybe through Tommy Rich, either through the Superstation or with wrestling magazine covers with those in-depth articles.
A lot, I'm sure. I mean, And I remember the wrestler and Inside Wrestling were usually like $1.75, $1.95. Like those were some of my favorites because
Mhm.
I mean I could just scrape up change before I left the house and get. And man, that's something. I mean, I know there's still a couple out there, but when there was no internet, all you could do was just watch wrestling and then go, like you said, to the bookstore, the grocery store, the newsstand, wherever, and find the latest edition of PWI, Inside Wrestling, all the different ones. And there was a bunch back then too. Man, I miss those days of the
Mhm.
getting to go and find those magazines and read stuff that not like it wasn't like dirt sheet type stuff, but you still learn stuff in there you didn't know. I liked going and reading the results in the back of the PWI of all the different cards from across the country, and I mean that
Were you
was
like me? Did you always look forward to the PWI Top 500
oh yes,
issue?
oh yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and that was the fun part too, is like where I was at, you got Memphis, you got Continental, you got WWF, and you got NWA, WCW, and then you had AWA and World Class on ESPN. But like only in the magazines could I see about, Portland and Florida and Mid South, Louisiana, and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, all these wrestlers that I read about growing up that I really didn't get to see until either they made it to one of the territories that I was watching or years later tape trading. Um, I mean, like I said, people, it's great that you can get on the internet at any given time and learn anything you want to know and get all the dirt and all that kind of stuff. But man, it was that excitement that would rush over me, like, hey, they got the new PWI, or they got the new whatever. And I'd stand there and read it while my mom's buying groceries. I mean, it was fun.
I
Like I say,
always
the
wanted to
shock of seeing
mail in.
Tommy Rich's bloody face
Uh,
right there in the middle of Kroger.
I always wanted to mail in that little voucher to get the red T-shirt with the white lettering, Pro Wrestling Illustrated with the logo. I was like, oh my gosh, because I remember it was like $4.95 shipping and handling,
that
with
usually
your
Mid Fight
voucher.
was modeling on the on the
Hmm. And there was like a frisbee in there too with PWI on it for some reason.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
Tommy Rich not only won, I think, most popular wrestler of the year from PWI, but he was Rookie of the Year in 1978, Most Improved just a year later. And again, I cannot stress enough how important those magazines were with Bill Apter and George Napolitano, their coverage for fans across the country to see these guys being recognized with those. Remember those plaques with the Pro Wrestling Illustrated?
Oh
They would
yeah.
have the awards issues, and just how much that hammered that point home for a lot of people.
That was before the 500 came along. That was always my favorite issue of the year was the year end awards and see who ended up with all the different awards each year and then squawk because your favorite one wasn't the one that they got robbed.
Yeah, the
Actually,
runner-up in big bold
yes,
attention. Yeah.
there's a Dusty Rhodes and Tommy Rich, not often seen tag
Wow.
team there. That picture stood out to me. I grabbed that one. I'm like, I can't think of a time that I actually saw them team together. So thought that was a fun pairing. You mentioned that Georgia tag team title. I think that's actually the
Oh,
ones they have
Stan.
on right there. Emmons
Hmm. Yeah, him and Stan.
so
And,
that's
and could you go back to that look, that one with Stan Hansen?
yeah.
And I promise, folks, this is not any. I'm not salivating at the look here. I'm just telling you how it is. Look at that hair. Look at that face. There is a reason women across the country and even some of his age demographic today, Tommy Rich was their man. I mean, goodness, he probably, I mean, I wasn't around back then at that time, but I'm sure he commanded a room not only with that raspy voice, but the looks. And, that was the thing, too. Tommy Rich was never a body guy. I don't know if I, ever saw him in tremendous physical conditioning, but, you know, just the way you work that style back then, he could go 25, 30 minutes with somebody if you needed to. And I want to tell a personal story. The second time I ever booked Tommy Rich, speaking of conditioning, and Gene, you're probably going to know exactly what I'm describing here, with the t-shirt that says Wildfire Tommy Rich with the flames, with the sleeves cut off, has the long tights that look like some kind of 90s music video vortex circles around with the old boots with the flames. And he was scheduled to face Johnny Rage this season. And I remember he came in. Now, granted, he had already stopped off and had a pitcher of margaritas at the Mexican restaurant up the road. We were running because he called to ask me when showtime was. Because he said, I've already had a pitcher of margaritas, but I can get over if I need to. And came in. And so I remember Mike Jackson was in the locker room. Mike's not on the internet, so he's not going to listen to this. It's for you guys. And he was joking with him. He's like, Tommy was like, what are we going to do, me and Johnny, about 4 or 5 minutes? And he seemed kind of disgusted about it. And Mike looked up at him and he's like, yeah, 4 to 5. I figure that's what you want. He's like, if you want me to work, I can go out there and work. And I don't know to this day if he's done it since. He went out there with Johnny Rage and worked 16 to 18 minutes doing a crucifix, doing a jackknife cover a la Ricky Steamboat. I mean, I felt like watching this, and I was the ring announcer that evening, that Tommy Rich was breaking out stuff he might not have done since the mid-1980s. And that crowd was kind of slow to it because Tommy had been around the West Georgia area on independence for a long time, and you're used to the 4 to 6 minute match where he probably doesn't even take a bump, just being honest. But once they got past the 10-minute mark and really started working, man, that hair was getting sweaty and matted. I mean, he helped make Johnny Rage to the Peach State people that night because even though Tommy went over 18 minutes, it felt like such a big throwback in time. And this would have been 2009. And like I said, he seemed kind of offended that evening. He's like, what, 4 minutes? And it's like, well, if you want to work, he's like, buddy, he started cutting a promo. He's like, I work. If you want me to work, I'm going to show you. He went out there and showed us. And I was like, because I had never really seen him do that. I don't know if anybody's seen it since. Tommy worked that hard. Like I said, a crucifix, jackknife. I mean, he even brought out a drop kick, and he got some air on it. And I'm like, this is bizarre. I was like, I can't make the excuse that a pitcher of margaritas would do it, because if that were the case, he'd probably be having 5-star classics throughout the early 2000s and the late 90s. But
that's, and that's something that, and you was talking about how over he was with the fans, and especially like the ladies in the 80s and into the 90s. But he was a great heel, and I liked his heel stuff in Memphis. But I always thought that Tommy Rich was probably number 2 right behind Ricky Morton on baby faces that could sell and really got over with their selling. Now he could fire up, when it was time and fight back, but he really drew people in with that, with the way he sold. And I've always said, I think, Ricky Morton, Tommy Rich, and Ricky Steamboat is probably the top 3 selling, babyface sellers in the history of the business, and really how they got over and drew people in, because there was people wanting to just come. I mean, you imagine Ole Anderson in there beating the hell out of Tommy Rich in '83 in Georgia. What kind of heat that got,
And Tommy with that look of anguish on his face and the deep bellow coming from his lungs of, when somebody made contact
and bleeding,
like you said, the selling was beautiful. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So a couple of other things, to touch on here randomly, because we're eventually going to get around here in a moment to kind of his second life in wrestling. I like to call it ECW. It kind of recreated him in a lot of ways. But before we got there, he had another run in Memphis in the 90s. And so this is kind of a look at that time period. There he is, USWA heavyweight champion, probably around 94, 95 right there. One of my favorite things of his is his tag team with Dangerous Doug Gilbert. They had
I forgot about that till I saw that picture.
They had a big feud with PG-13, Wolfie D and Jamie Dundee, Casey Ice, that is really considered to be the last big Memphis territory feud before the USWA completely died out. Like, they drew the last few big houses in Memphis, which even those weren't big by the standards of what Memphis had been. But Randy Hales and different people who were running the show at the time have credited that feud with being what held Memphis on an extra probably year and a half. And they had some wild. I drove to Memphis back then and saw some of those matches, and they had some wild matches. And I love this picture right here, because there you got Tommy Rich, Buddy Landau, a favorite of mine. I've always been a huge fan of the Gilberts, Eddie and Doug, and then you got Brian Christopher in there. And it's sad that so many people only know Brian as Grandmaster from Too Cool, and they only know the
Mhm.
WWE guy. Because man, if you go and folks, if you're any kind of wrestling fan, there's no excuse anymore to not see. Like, there's tons of Memphis on YouTube. I mean, years and years and years worth of TV on YouTube. He was such a great heel in the early part of his career. In this era right here, the Memphis Mafia, they called it. But man, go on there and watch Tommy's stuff. Doug, Eddie, Buddy Landell. Uh, we're definitely gonna get around to doing a show on Buddy Landell one of these days. But Brian, like, watch Brian
Oh,
Christopher's
absolutely.
early heel work there in Memphis. Every guy in that picture were top heels in Memphis, and check it out. You'll be glad you did. And around that same time, there was a promotion, and I'll see if you have any knowledge of this. There was a promotion that I've been told came together with some money mark that I've heard was like a lottery winner or something, called the AWF, the American Wrestling Federation. And apparently Tito Santana had a big hand in guiding this guy, along with Sergeant Slaughter. But they had a bunch of guys. They did like maybe 2 TV tapings. There's a DVD set out there somewhere.
Was this around New Jersey?
Up that way, because you had the tag team of Tommy Rich and Greg the Hammer Valentine was their tag team champions. Tito was their heavyweight champion. You had Slaughter there. A ton of other, Mr. Hughes and Jeff Gaylord, the Freebirds came like after their WCW run with the short hair, and a bunch of people worked there. But it was weird because they're like rounds, kind of like British wrestling almost. But like I say, it was just TV taping matches. There was very little excitement. Like, it was just, like I say, I bought the DVD set, watched it one time. I was like, well, okay, that was an interesting time capsule of like 1994, 5, whenever that was. But no need to ever watch it again. But the tag team of Greg the Hammer Valentine and Tommy Rich was interesting to me, especially during like that stage of Tommy's career. They look like they should be a tag team at the time. Like, it was actually
matching hair.
One of the highlights. Yeah, one of the highlights of that set of tapings, or whatever you want to call it, was them two as a tag team, because everything else was pretty much like, yeah, I could have passed on that. But anyway, not to go too far down. Here's a picture that I skipped over earlier. Look at that. 1990.
That's got to be a Great American Bash, right?
That is it. Great American Bash, 1990. This would have been just a few months before Harley retired and gets the win over Tommy. Kind of illustrating your point from earlier.
And wasn't Tommy, didn't he do some work as a heel in Smoky Mountain for Cornette?
Yes, he was there at the tail end of Smoky Mountain. I think he may have been champion when it shut down, because I want to say there's some. I haven't watched them, but there's some videos on YouTube I've been meaning to watch where apparently Corny is like ranting about Tommy doing something with the Smoky Mountain title, and Cornette had to try to get it back. But I guess Cornette owed him some money, or at least Tommy felt like Cornette owed him some money. And
I hope it's not a rant like the one on Tim Horner.
I can only imagine. That's why I haven't watched it, because I like Tommy Rich and I like Jim Cornette. I don't really want to hear a bunch of any more bad stuff that I've already heard about Tommy already, because that completely changed my outlook on Tim Horner. Because I always thought everybody thought Tim Horner was just a great guy, and then like, whew. And not to say just Cornette says it, I no longer think Tim Horner's a good guy, but it was eye opening, some of the stuff that he had to say about him. That's for sure.
That was broke down in minute detail about Tim Horner.
Yes. If you don't know what we're referring to, just put Jim Cornette, Tim Horner on YouTube and search it. There's several videos, and while you're there, make sure you check out Tim Horner's music video of him singing Garth Brooks' "Shameless" from Smoky Mountain Wrestling Circuit 1993.
And you talked about his second life in ECW, leader of the full-blooded Italians. I mean, Tommy Rich was the big Don, like I just remember like watching, because I was watching some ECW at the time. I think that was before it was on TNN, when it was like the Sunshine Network out of Florida. And we got that on our satellite dish. And I remember seeing Tommy with Tracy Smothers, and I'm like, what? Because even then, now I would have been like around 18 years old, and I'm like, what is Tommy Rich from Take Your Pick, Tennessee/Georgia, doing up there in ECW in Philadelphia as the Big Don with the full-blooded Italians? But it worked.
It did, and actually the first few times that I got to work on any shows like around Corinth, Mississippi with Tommy. He was right in the middle of that Big Don run, and so he would come down there and he'd be wearing the FBI shirt and all that, and was completely lost on the people there because at that point I really hadn't seen much of it. I've seen enough of it to know what it was referencing, but I hadn't seen a lot of it. But when I did finally get to see it, I'm trying to download a picture right now. Did you ever see the flag they had, the Italian flag they had with Tommy's face on it?
I don't remember his face on it. I remember the flag. I remember the FBI T-shirts. But...
Yeah, I was trying to find. I love that. If I could get an Italian flag with Tommy Rich's face on it for my wrestling room here, you best believe it would be hanging up. I can't. I found one the other day, and I guess it didn't download or something. But anyway, in the future, I'll have to try to track that down and just throw it into a random episode because it's hilarious. Because it's the face that classic Tommy Rich face on an Italian flag is just the oddest thing you'll ever see. But
a couple of why am I doing the Italian when I go to make a point? A couple of things about Tommy that struck me, as we were getting ready to do this. I don't know if there's ever been an action figure on Tommy Rich. Even though he was in WCW at the time, the Galoob series didn't have him. Even when WWF did the Classic series, where they expounded upon a lot of people, Tommy not included. And, you may be better at this than I, Gene, but is he the only NWA World Champion that's not in the WWE Hall of Fame? Flair is, Harley Race, both Briscoes, Terry Funk, Lou Thez, Buddy Rogers,
Dory Jr.
Yeah, Dory Jr., Pat O'Connor, I believe he's in as well. So it's kind of funny because for a lot of newer people, like when there's no action figures, there's no WWE Hall of Fame accolades for a guy like Tommy. But I think for anyone over the age of 35, what we're talking about, this guy done some pretty big stuff.
And Tommy's one of the only guys that, to my knowledge, never set foot in the WWE. He didn't do a job there. He didn't do a one-off at a WWF Birmingham house show or anything like that. Like, I don't think they've ever acknowledged his existence in the WWE, short of just him being in old WCW footage and ECW footage, obviously, which is bizarre, like you say, given his history and his being a former champion and all that. Makes you wonder who high up just has something against him that they would just completely box him out like that. And maybe that's not the case.
But I would say he's still one of the most popular wrestlers on the independent circuit. He's so good at the gimmick table and on the microphone and throwing out those words, old school. We're going to do it like back when wrestling was wrestling. And you and I have talked about this, and I'm going to touch on it some here. He's always holding court in Charlotte, North Carolina, that first weekend in August at the Hilton, whether it be my dad and I have nicknamed Tommy the Rover, because if you see him that weekend, you don't see him somewhere long. It's always about 4 or 5 minutes. He might be outside smoking. He might be up at the bar. He might be at his table with his vendor. He might be at the Hall of Fame. He might be grabbing a BLT sandwich from the one convenience shop in that hotel, which I take umbrage with, by the way. Food and beverage is at a premium there. But there's always people around Tommy, and it's good to see him. I remember he had the hip replacement surgery on crutches, and now he's got the teeth fixed, and he's walking really without the limp that much. But one story, and I think I might have told you this in the locker room at a recent show, but it was last year when David Schultz, Dr. D, was doing his Q&A, and the Hall of Heroes ran long. So there was only like 40 of us in that room with David Schultz while the Hall of Heroes is going. Well, they ran long. I think Tommy had to use the restroom. He came in the Hawaiian shirt, the Bermuda shorts, and the flip flops. Pops in, sees 40 people with Dr. D, and Schultz goes, "What are you doing?" And Tommy says, I didn't know that you was having class in here. I got class down the hall, and I'll come back to your class when my class lets out." And he walks out, and it's quiet. And Schultz just does like the double take to us and goes, "Motherfucker." Cracked me. Tommy has almost that cartoonish ability to pop up sometimes at inopportune times. But I don't know if there's footage of it, but goodness, about this was probably 6 years ago. The roast of Ole Anderson, to hear Tommy Rich roast Ole, but then he really spoke from the heart about what Ole did for him when his career, and he spoke from the heart. He got a little bit emotional, but I love that he ended it with he was saying these emotional things. He's like, "And I've never been good one at wrapping it up. So fuck you, Ole," and walked off the stage.
Yeah, those things, it's almost like Tommy is able to morph from one place to the other. Because I swear we have passed him talking to somebody, went down the hall and around the corner, and like he's there. Like we're like, how did he get? He's everywhere. Like he's all over the place. But some part of the fun of a lot of those that I've gone to is just seeing Tommy's interactions with people that I just happen to be around for, whether it's other wrestlers or just fans in general. He's a funny guy, whether he's trying to or not. But he's just entertaining in general.
And that's another story from last year. I'm getting on the elevator with Bill Eadie and Barry Darsow, and as the elevator doors are closing, I don't know if my hands are doing this right, ever so slowly, Tommy's head appears and goes, "Hey, can y'all hold that elevator?" As it closes, and Bill Eadie just goes, "Jesus Christ." It's so funny. That's why I say he's always popping around like a Looney Tunes character the whole weekend. But it's good with people, man. He'll sit there and tell you stories, man. He'll talk.
Oh my goodness, yeah. I've got a few Tommy Rich stories from over the years. I'll save them for some other time because I don't want them to seem like I'm being negative or anything. But I've seen, like I said, I've had some funny interactions, and I've seen some funny ones. You talk about those conventions. The first one I ever went to was Greg Price's one that he did in Atlanta. I never could ever make out to Charlotte the first few times. I eventually did a few years in a row, but the first one I went to was Atlanta, and I got the opportunity to take this picture with Tommy Rich and Austin Idol. And as I told you, that was one of the big heel feuds in which, in that same day, shortly after that picture was taken, this picture was taken. Which,
oh my goodness!
All things considered, that's a pretty fun one, considering what their feud was back then. But I don't know. Like he's one of those guys that, some guys were a pretty good baby face or a really good heel, back and forth. But like like I said, he was great heel in Memphis, but he was one of the best baby faces of all time. I mean, he's an all around one of the best to ever do it, in my opinion. And I do think it's unfair, for whatever those reasons are, if there are any, that he's not in the WWE Hall of Fame and hasn't been honored on a national, worldwide stage like that. Because, like I say, there's a lot of guys that never set foot. Bullet Bob, got a Hall of Fame induction, and a lot of guys have. And I think he deserves it, if nothing else, for his early career. I mean, people might say, well, in ECW, he wasn't like he was in the top tier, or WCW in the later years. Like you said, he was used as kind of enhancement almost. But shoot, I mean, he's done more in the first half of his career than some of the guys that are. I mean, I hate to always use this as an example, and maybe it's shitty of me, but like Coco Beware's in the Hall of Fame, and Tommy Rich is. How is that possible? And I'm not knocking Coco Beware or his career. But gosh, I mean, Tommy Rich has certainly done a lot more in his career than Coco Beware ever did, or the Bushwhackers, or But anyway, like I say, not trying to
Brooklyn Brawler. I mean, we could go on down the list there, but
yeah.
I mean, and just you talked about what he accomplished in the first portion of his career. I'm thinking of something too, from about 78 to maybe 99, a 21-year stretch starting, with the NWA down to ECW. He worked with everybody. anybody that, Sal Renardo is fond of using this, I'm your favorite wrestler's favorite wrestler, but all of your favorite wrestlers, I bet you Tommy Rich worked with just about every single one of them across the way, because just who we've name dropped in this conversation and ones that we haven't even. I mean, you're talking guys like Lawler and Flair and Piper and Dusty Rhodes and Arn Anderson, the who's who of pro wrestling. And it wasn't like Tommy was just in these matches. He was treated as an equal, or something to, definitely a threat to these guys. And I think about my dad telling stories about Tommy Rich was big in Carrollton, but man, when the night before at the City Auditorium in Atlanta, Georgia, before the Omni came, and then certainly when the Omni came, Tommy was still big. We get into the feud with Buzz Sawyer, but City Auditorium and the Omni. I mean, Tommy Rich was the dude, the man of Atlanta for about 3 or 4 years, and I mean that's who they came to see. And it's just I'm glad we're doing shows like this so that people can hopefully, if they didn't know already, can realize that. That guy that you see that's talking about fired up and maybe looking for a cheeseburger, that guy meant something, man. And he meant a whole hell of a lot to a hell of a lot of people across the nation.
Sold a lot of tickets and put a lot of asses in seats, and that's why I've been flooding the Cheap Eat TV YouTube channel here lately for people who are subscribed to it, with a lot of just all over the page pro wrestling stuff. But I've put quite a bit of Tommy Rich stuff up. I've put it on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, under where I shared tonight's live cast, I put some links to a Southern Championship Wrestling Tommy Rich's Blood Battles of the South, with some great Tommy Rich matches, and then some links to some stuff like Austin Idol and Tommy Rich against Lawler and Bam Bam Bigelow in a Texas Death Match from Memphis, and tag team match, which kind of stood out to me from WCW around 1990. It was Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert against the Midnight Express, Bobby and Stan.
Oh my goodness.
A fantastic match. So do yourself a favor, if you're not real familiar with Tommy, if you're only familiar with one aspect of his career, go check some of that stuff out on YouTube, and I think you'll enjoy it, and I think you'll have a better understanding of what he has meant to the business as a whole, besides maybe just what little bit you've been exposed to. So, I think, is there anything else we need to say to put a bow on the Tommy Rich episode?
Not that I can think of, Gene. Man, an hour goes fast when you're having fun.
It does, and we went a little over an hour, but I figured, I was like, if we get too deep into Tommy Rich, this thing could go too. But right now, let's announce who is going to be the topic of episode number 3. Well, it would have been more dramatic if it would have popped up when I hit the drum roll in it. But there it is, Exotic Adrian Street.
Ooh, you talk about a character.
Yes. Man. So many wild stories about Adrian Street. I mean, you think of a guy. I mean, you take a look at him. If you're not familiar with Adrian Street, you think of when this guy came along in the 80s. Spent the bulk of his career wrestling in the Southeast. And what's crazy is, not to get too much into it, I'm sure we will in the show, but like, to play the character he was playing or portraying in that era in the South,
yes,
he got a lot of heat. But Adrian was so talented at what he did and so good in the ring, even with people the way they were, mindsets the way they were in that era, still came to love Adrian. And he became a huge babyface despite that, which to me is just says more than I can say about what a talented wrestler he was. And what was funny is, like, people in the crowd would see him like, oh, this sissy or whatever. Adrian Street was the toughest guy on just about any card he was ever on. He would take you down, tie you in a knot, or knock you out. Either one. It didn't have to be either or. He could. He was legitimately a very tough man. And what a story of how he, came from England and trained and got in the wrestling business and eventually developed this character. him and his wife Linda, who was his valet, all that wild gear you seen, they made every bit of that stuff themselves, and then later made gear for, I think to this day Linda still makes gear for wrestlers and belts and
He does. I see it advertised on Facebook. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm excited about that episode because again, and there has been some stuff done about Adrian. They did that little documentary on WWE Network, a little short one about him, and they've made a movie about him. But I haven't heard a lot of podcasts about him, and I think maybe the perspective of a couple of guys who I saw a lot of his stuff in Continental. I saw him on some Memphis shows when I was a kid. Been around him some on a few shows over the years, so I think we'll have some interesting insight to give on Adrian Street. I'm not gonna haul off and announce a date right now because last time I did that I shot myself in the foot. But we will just keep an eye on our Facebooks, social media. We will be announcing that real soon, and you can see it on Cheap Heat TV Live. We always announce it on there. This Sunday, episode number 56. I'm not going to be around. I'm going to be out of town this weekend. So the guys are going to have Whitey Jenkins on as a pre-show for his Outlaw Wrestling Wrestle War show that he's got coming up. It's going to be that show is going to debut later that night after this podcast. If you haven't watched Whitey Jenkins OWF, I can't even begin to explain what it is. Just give it a chance. Check it out. It's funny is all I can say. So give it a chance because there it is coming up this Sunday night at 7:30 p.m. Episode number 7, Wrestle War. It's you have to see it to believe it. It's something else. Anything you need to plug, Shane?
Useless trivia. I'm doing that tomorrow night in Gaston, Alabama, near your neck of the woods, out at Back 40 Brewing Company. Lots of good beer and food on tap, and it is week 8 of our 10-week summer league as we get ready to go into the home stretch here. But going back, and we don't have a date, but man, episode 3, the exotic Adrian Street. What a story for us to do an old school dive and to talk about, because I don't know if there's anybody that has a career much like Adrian. Just like, I know I said that about Jesse Ventura in the first episode, but polar opposite. Nobody did anything like what Jesse did. I don't think anybody's had a career of what Adrian Street has endured. And I don't want to go long on it, but what you were talking about, doing that character, 2 words, tolerance and acceptance, were not exactly prevalent in the Southeast when he was doing this.
No, if you're under a certain age, you can't even begin to understand what the mindset was like back then. I mean, it took a lot of balls to go out and play that character. Like I said, there wasn't anybody out there that was going to take down Adrian. But we'll get into that more on our next episode. And like I said, we'll be announcing real soon when that'll be coming up. And if you enjoyed tonight's show, enjoyed the first show with Jesse. Again, if you have anyone that you would like to see discussed on the show, feel free to send it to me or Shane, either one or both, and we will work it in the rotation. Just a little look ahead. We're going to do episodes like we've been doing about singular wrestling stars, but we also have some ideas about, talking about some particular events, talking about wrestling things from our childhood, like the old LJN wrestling figures, or maybe even the Galoob WCW figures, the Remco AWA figures, and the old Coliseum video VHS tapes. I'm a big fan of them. You can't really kind of see over here in the background. I can back there. So we got some of those that I could pull out and show we could talk about. So a lot of fun stuff in the future. Anything that you would like to suggest, you'd like to see more of, less of, whatever, we're open to hearing your comments. We want this to be fun for everybody and enjoy it like we are, because I'm having fun doing this. Like I said at the beginning of last show, it's a way to put what most people consider useless wrestling knowledge to some kind of use. And I recently, on 2 different occasions, was referred to as a wrestling historian recently. So I think if it gets said one more time, I can probably put it on my resume for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Though, so
One more moniker for the king of all wrestling movies.
Because I'm hurting for monikers over here, as you well know.
Well, Gene,
All
you
right.
mentioned Coliseum home video. I've had a great time tonight. Thank you guys for listening and watching. And I think I might go pop in bloopers, bleeps, and body slams before I drift off to dream.
There you go. And, get a dose of Lord Alfred Hayes before you go to sleep. That's always a good way to go. All right, folks. Thank you for watching. We'll have the audio version. Will be out in the next couple of days. Please help spread it around and subscribe to the Cheap Eat TV YouTube channel. Thanks.